Hello, everybody, and welcome to Differential Discussions. I'm Melissa,
I'm Dave.
and we're going to talk about just the 5 normal types of white cells today.
I'm laughing at myself because I just did like the radio voice thing. Did you hear that? Anywho.
It's your telephone voice.
I know.
We've got that from years of answering the phone while we're working in the clinical labs. Rheumatology, this is Melissa.
So yeah, we're talking about normal white cells that we're talking about today.
Normal white cells. Yep.
Cool.
Yep.
So what do we have here in your professional opinion?
Yeah. So these are basophils.
I agree with that assessment. Yeah.
So in general, there are the 5 normal whites. Basophils, eosinophils, monocytes, lymphocytes, and neutrophils. And so we're going to look at the infrequent cells, and we'll move up to the more frequent cells. So basophils we don't see them very often.
Yeah. I mean, we've done plenty of diffs in our professional career where we may not count a single one, right? But yeah, these 2 photos are really, I think, representative of the diversity of presentations you can have. There's always going to be some variability in staining and things like that, but I really like the one on the right, even though it's not what some may call like a sexy cell, right? There's a lot, it kind of looks a little messed up, but I think it demonstrates something really important about the basophil. So maybe we start on the left. Do you want to talk about the fella on the left, or?
Yeah, sure. So typically when you look at basophils, or when we think about basophils, they have the big dark purpley, black, dark blue color for the granules, and the granules are large. They're really sizable. And when you look at the size, shape, look to these granules, they are not of equal shape and equal size. Some of them are large, some of them are small. I don't mean some of them are huge. I just mean in comparison to one another. You might have one that's this big and the next one's a little bit smaller, and so on and so forth. And the same thing with shape. I don't mean you have triangles and rectangles and, all these crazy shapes that you learn in geometry. I mean that you just have some that are round, some that are ovoid. So slightly different shapes. So different shape, different size, but they're huge. And one of the most important features is that the granules are on top of the nucleus.
Yes.
And you learn as you go that the more you play with your fine tune, the more you get to see. So you can really see those granules when you play with the fine tune adjustment on the microscope. And you can see in this one that we have here on the left here, that you can see the granules on top of the nucleus. So you can see, like, there's one here, there's another one here. So there's a bunch of them on top of the nucleus. And that is one of the characteristics when we're thinking about basophils.
Yep. And then the one on the right, I think the reason why I liked this one so much is when I was studying hematology to sit for the SH, I came to learn that the granules in the basophil are water soluble, right? So sometimes you get this phenomena where the water during the staining process gets into these cells and causes the granules to kind of bleed, and they bleed their color out. So this is another kind of characteristic. It may not happen all the time, but when it does, this bleeding of the color like this, it would be indicative and suggestive of me when I look at the slide that this is a basophil. So I know that the one on the right's a bit messy. It's kind of hard to make out the detail, but I love that quality of it to use as a teaching tool. And then also, even though it is a little bit messier, we can still see that it's quite difficult to see the nucleus, right? It's being obscured by those granules.
Like, you can tell there's a piece here and there's a piece there, but then even looking at it, you might say, like, this kind of looks like a granule right here, like right on top of the nucleus. And we may be able to still see some of the granulation on top of the nucleus, even though the granules in the cytoplasm have kind of washed out.
Yep. And then when the granules do tend to wash out, they give this brilliant purple pink color that I don't have the vocabulary to properly describe. But when you look at enough cells, that color
Yeah,
tells me it is not a neutrophil at all. Okay, so
absolutely.
it's tough because again, I think this comes with time and repetition, and the more cells you see, the more that this becomes intuitive. But yeah, that color is indicative of the basophil as well. But cool.
Well, and then the basals are challenging because you don't see them very often.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Definitely see the least out of most other cells. Besides the next one, maybe, right? This one's a little bit more frequent. Is
Yeah, yeah,
the
for sure.
EOs.
A little bit more frequent.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people will say that the EO is their favorite, right? They're brilliant in color, beautiful, some might say.
Yep, very
But
nice, bright
yeah,
orange.
what can we say about the nucleus in eosinophils?
So the nucleus is generally bilobed. So like this, where you have two distinct lobes. And let me bring my pencil back. You have two distinct lobes here, and they are connected by a very thin piece of filament. So they are not separate. They're connected. It's just sometimes like this one, you can see this filament here, and then this one you can't, but there's always a filament connecting them if they're a normal eosinophil. So they're typically bilobed. Occasionally they're trilobed, but typically they're bilobed. Did you want to add anything else about the?
Yeah, just to compare them a little bit, foreshadowing when we get to neutrophils. Neutrophils typically have significantly more lobes, more in the 3 to 5 range than the bilobe. So in the situation where the color is failing you, right? So if for whatever reason the color doesn't stand out like it's an eosinophil, one of these characteristics you can take into account is this bilobe nucleus.
Yep.
And then, of course, we must talk about the granules. So what does the textbook call these? What is it, Charcot-Leyden or something?
Yeah, so they contain Charcot-Leyden protein. That's why you see Charcot-Leyden crystals sometimes in urines and body fluids. But more than the major thing is major basic protein inside of those granules, because EOs are known for parasites, right? They're there when you have parasites, particularly helminth organisms, because major basic protein is the protein that helps get rid of those helminths.
Mm-hmm. And that's characteristic of this color, right? The fact that we get this brilliant color is indicative of the contents of the granules. But yeah, EO granules are just mesmerizing, beautiful color. And they're sizable as well, right? So these are big, kind of like the basophil granules.
They are. The difference is they are of equal shape and equal size.
So uniformity, huh?
Yes.
Yep. Good. So yeah, we chose these two. What I liked about the cell on the right is we can see that the cytoplasm's incompletely filled. And you can see characteristics of the cytoplasm absent the granules influence. So you get this kind of sky blue, or really, really faint light kind of color to the cytoplasm. And I think this is useful as a morphologist going forward. So I'm talking about this, we're talking about normal cells, but later on when you get into more advanced stuff, knowing what to expect the cytoplasm to look like when it's empty, I think is important. So, and this isn't indicative of anything wrong with this person, or it's just kind of by chance how everything is kind of laying in the cytoplasm. But yeah, EOs are awesome.
And I think you get that change where sometimes like this with this cell on the right, where some of the granules are more on the other side of the nucleus than this, because you took a 3D structure and forced it to be a 2D structure.
Yes.
And so that's why you're getting that. And then it's important to note that if you empty the granules from the granulocytes, so your granulocytes are your basophils, your eosinophils, and your neutrophils. If you empty the granules, there is no real coloration. There is nothing in there. And that's why this cell is so cool here, where you can see that there's really nothing in there when you remove those granules. No color, nothing exciting.
Yep. I'm glad you related them all together too, because I think it's important that we think of EOs, basos, and neutrophils as part of that evolutionary kind of relation to one another. they're very closely related. As a contrast to like a lymph, right, which is a very unique place in our immune system and defense mechanisms.
Well, and we'll talk about the maturation sequence, and we can talk about eos versus basal versus neutrophils and how they share common morphological features in the early stages, but that's for a different video.
Yes, it is. Yes, beyond the scope. The scope.
All right, so let's talk about the next cell that you'll see with slight increased frequency above eos and basos would be
Drum roll. Our monos.
monos or monocytes.
Love monos. So yeah, the monocytes, I think this was, I think when I'm reflecting on myself as a student, I remember looking at a mono and being like, oh, horseshoe shaped nucleus. I got this, no problem, right? And then you start doing the work and they start doing weird stuff. You got the guy on the right, right? He's like, I'm not doing a horseshoe shaped nucleus. So the literature, some literature would describe the nucleus of the monocyte as pleomorphic,
Yes.
right? So there's many different kind of shapes. And I think the only thing consistent about a mononucleus really is the chromatin pattern itself. Would you say?
Yep, absolutely. Because the shape, it can do whatever it wants.
Yep.
So, when we're talking about the shape, meh.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yes, the pattern itself, the chromatin pattern, is unique to the monocyte. Textbooks will describe it as lacy, right? And I know a lot of people will be like, what the heck do you mean by lacy?
Yeah. Sometimes using these words is tricky because you just don't know someone's real interaction if they've ever thought about lace or anything like that. But when I think of a lacy pattern, I think of like grandma's doilies or whatever, right?
Okay.
And you hold them up and you look and there's all these little holes.
Yeah.
And so when I think about that word and what it means to the morphology of the chromatin pattern in the mono, I can see those holes now. I see those negative areas, right, where there's no stain. Yeah.
Interesting. I think of it slightly differently. I think of a garter belt, like when a woman, sometimes they'll wear garter belts when they get married under their wedding dress. I did not, but I know I've seen garter belts.
Sure.
And you know how the lace of those types of things will have like this almost squiggly pattern, but it's a very subtle squiggle. That's what I think of, because the white striations throughout the nucleus, they're very subtle. And if you look at them, they're not solid white striations like you see in a neutrophil. They're more of this nice, subtle, almost like a soft squiggle. They're very soft in comparison. And so that's generally what I think of it as.
Yeah, that's the problem with this stuff, right?
I know.
Words fail us.
Yeah.
And as educators, we're always struggling with how to vocalize like what our minds see and feel, and
what our gut says.
yeah, exactly, because it really does end up being a gut feeling. I mean, when I'm making a distinction on a particular cell, doing a 100 cell differential, it's seconds or less, right, where we're making a decision. So I think the gut is certainly a part of it. But yeah, the nucleus, think of that lacy, fine kind of chromatin pattern relative to our more mature cells, which we might talk about at the end of the video. We'll talk a little bit more about chromatin pattern. But now what about the cytoplasm of the mono? I think the cytoplasm has some distinct features too.
It does, yeah. The textbooks will tell you ground glass sort of appearance. You can also think of it as more of like a sandy sort of appearance, or kind of grainy sort of look to it. And it's like a bluish gray sort of color. Now, when people are learning, they just go vacuoles. If there's a vacuole, it's a mono. Vacuoles are more common in monos, but they don't hold a monopoly on having vacuoles. Any cell can have a vacuole.
So true. Yeah, that first time you see a lymph, right, and it's got a vacuole, and you're like, what? So yeah, vacuoles can be a good signpost, a good guide of sorts, but it shouldn't rule the cell identification.
Yeah, I know.
And
You want to have kind of a list in your head. Does it have a pleomorphic nucleus? Does it have the lacy pattern in the chromatin? Is it kind of this bluish grayish color? And we say bluish gray because sometimes, like, you can see this one on the left is really more blue, and this one over here is almost more gray. So bluish gray. Does it have that? Is it kind of grainy looking? And then, oh, there's vacuoles. Well, that also supports that it's a mono in addition to everything else.
right. Yep. And then they can have some pink granulation in them too, right? I think I see on the one on the left side of my screen,
Yep.
in the very bottom of the cytoplasm, there's a little like foot kind of off of the cytoplasm. And I think I see a couple, so the other cell, sorry.
Here. Oh, in here.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
right
yeah.
here.
Right there. Yep.
Yep.
And those are like the characteristic kind of pink monogranules
So
that
there's
might
one
show.
there, one there, one
Mhm.
there,
Yep.
that kind of thing. So I drew it. So let me clear it. And now you can kind of see the granules where I just drew them for you. This one does have some as well. They're just more this one over here. Like I can see some over here.
Mhm. Yep.
But they're more scattered and they're very pinpoint. So, you know, in comparison to the eosinophil and the basophil, which they have granules covering their cytoplasm, this one doesn't really have granules covering the cytoplasm, but it does have some fine granulation mixed in.
Mhm. Yep.
So I think that's a subtle difference because a mono is not technically a granulocyte.
Mhm.
It's technically one of the mononuclear cells, but it does have some fine granulation in there.
So I'm thinking, are there other things? Or I think that's a pretty good summation, right? Of
Yep.
monos. Yep.
Yeah, we'll have another video where we differentiate reactive lymphocytes, which is a different bag of worms.
Yes.
You know, thinking in terms of that, there's a whole lot more to talk about. But for now, for a mono, I think we can move on to the next cell.
Yeah. What's coming up next? Jeez, there's not much left.
No?
The lymphocytes.
Lymphocytes.
So yeah, lymphs can vary a bit. I think one of the things that like I look for is chromatin pattern and should be king, I think, right? So a accomplished morphologist, chromatin pattern should rule the day most of the time. There's probably case exceptions, but generally speaking, that's the most important feature. But one of the things I tend to kind of lean on a little bit is the nucleus to cytoplasm ratio. I think it's kind of useful to talk about with lymphocytes.
Absolutely.
So when I say that, I talk about, I'm kind of speaking about volume, right? So when I take into consideration the entire volume of the cell, how much is visibly nucleus and how much is visibly cytoplasm? And I think you could describe the lymphocyte as having a high nucleus to cytoplasm ratio.
You know, here's the cytoplasm, my terrible drawing with it, but here's the cytoplasm, you know, and then this much of the cell is nucleus.
Right.
So definitely the nucleus takes up the majority of the cell for most normal lymphocytes.
Yep. Yeah, and as a lymphocyte becomes, and correct me if I'm using imprecise words, but as a lymphocyte becomes activated, because you'll see its cytoplasm is going to change and its nucleus will sort of change, right, as it undergoes some biological processes. But yeah, geez, what else can we say about lymphs?
Well, the other thing with lymphs, not even just when they're activated, is that there are some that are normal that are called large granular lymphs.
Yes. Yep.
And so they are bigger, they have more cytoplasm, they have a few azurophilic granules that you find in there. They're not granular like granulocytes, but there are a few large granules inside of the cytoplasm. And think of it, when you think of lymphs, the reason why there's so much heterogeneity among the morphology of lymphocytes is because there's a lot of heterogeneity among lymphocytes themselves. You have not only T cells and B cells, but then you have all the subtypes of T cells that you have to think about. And then you have natural killer cells, and they all circulate. And morphologically, we really can't tell them apart, although you can see the subtle differences, but you can't look at this and say, this is a T helper 1 cell subtype. Right. I can tell. We just can't do that. We just know it's a lymph. We don't know what subtype. And so that's what makes lymph so difficult. is the heterogeneity of the lymphs themselves.
Yeah, excellent point. Form follows function, right? That's
Yes.
the saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we don't have one here, but a large granular lymph. The granules are described as xerophilic. I would say pink, right? They have like a
Purple,
pretty
yeah.
pink purpley color to them. And then, you know, I think differentiating lymphs and monos ends up being kind of the struggle here. And so we just showed you monos, and monos have those pinpoint pink granules, right?
Yeah.
In my experience, when there's granules in a lymph, they're generally kind of larger than the pinpoint of the mono. Is that your experience as well? Yeah.
Generally, I've seen a few with pinpoints, but generally they're larger.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's one thing, but
I think another thing though is size. Like you were saying, like lymphs are generally small, like these guys, where the nucleus takes up the majority of the cell. They don't have a whole lot of cytoplasm, and monos are not like that. They are large. If you want to think about like fitting red cells into these cells, right? Because you can use the red cells around to kind of help tell the story. The nucleus of a small round resting lymph should be about the size of red cells around, if the red cells are normocytic. Not all red cells are normocytic, of course, keep that in mind. And then if the lymphocyte's a little bit spready, that's not going to hold true. So you can still use it as a guide though, because look at these cells. Sure, they're a little bit, large with a little bit of a cytoplasm that, some lymphs you expect them to be smaller with less cytoplasm. But when you think about the comparison to the red cells, you're maybe going to fit 1 or 2, maybe 1.5 red cells inside of a whole lymph versus a mono. You're probably going to get 3 or 4 red cells size-wise onto a monocyte. So lymphs are a lot smaller. They're a lot more condensed in that they're not big and spready and reaching in the way that monocytes would be.
Yeah, and I guess one other thing too, to counter some of the description of the monocyte, is lymph nuclei are generally round or kidney bean shaped, right? Like we've definitely seen them break the rules, but like most often you can bet that the lymphocytes will be round or just slightly kind of, a bean shape.
Yeah. And generally the cytoplasm is not that grainy appearance that you see in monos.
True.
Generally it's more of a clear kind of looking cytoplasm, and maybe there'll be those xerophilic granules in there and maybe not, but generally it's a more clear cytoplasm than a mono.
Agreed.
Right. Ready to talk about the most common cell type in adults?
Let's do it. The
Neutrophil.
So yeah, this one, this might be one of the hardest cells to talk about for me, because it's the most intuitive, right? Yeah, I mean, I think the name of the game here is, a bit of nucleus shape, a bit of cytoplasm color, but the nucleus shape is segmented, polysegmented, some might say, right? So many segments, and these segments connected by fine filaments, generally speaking.
Yes. 3 to 5 lobes is normal. So 3 to 5 of these different segments with the filaments connecting them. So that's normal. If you have more than 5, 6 or more, then it's hyper segmented. If you have less than 3, so 2 or less, then that's hypo segmented. So that's generally how we think about the nucleus. The cytoplasm, the granules are pinpoint. So compare that to an eosinophil or a basophil, where their granules are sizable and chunky. So if for some reason this eosinophil's granules became more of an orangey, hot pink kind of color, you see that more in body fluids than in peripheral bloods. But if for some reason, you can look at the size of the granulation as another tool to say, are they pinpoint or are they sizable? Are they large?
You meant to say neutrophil, maybe, perhaps? I think you said eosinophil.
Oh, yeah, sorry, eosinophils.
No problem.
So yeah, neutrophils, we're gonna have that pinpoint color, the granules. Sometimes in body fluids, they can be a little bit hot pink.
Right, yeah.
So, and they look like an EO. That's why I'm thinking of EOs in addition.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that color that you just touched on too, just a little aside, the color that cells represent is a product of the cells themselves and the pH of everything kind of going on around them, right?
Yeah.
So color is a very useful tool, but sometimes it'll shift. The colors will shift.
Yeah.
What I find to be the case, though, is that things will look, more basophilic or less basophilic, and it affects everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's like this shift from one side to the other.
Yeah.
And chromatin pattern on the neutrophil, very, very dark, very clumped and condensed.
Yeah.
But typically the shape is the big seller for these guys.
Absolutely. That with the pinpoint granules.
Yep.
And just like the rest of the granulocytes, if you remove the granules, there's really nothing to the cytoplasm.
That's right. So if we think back to our EO, right? The neutrophil, if we remove all of its granules, will have that coloration, that kind of texture to it.
All right. So why don't we take another couple of minutes and just talk about chromatin patterns?
Let's do it. Sounds good. Yeah. Perfect.
So note there's a neutrophil here. The EO and baso are not here because the chromatin pattern is similar to the neutrophil. So that's why the neutrophil is here. I mean, the basophil, you're probably not going to see the nucleus anyway, but for completeness, the granulocytes generally share that same clumpiness. So that's why we're comparing the neutrophil, the lymphocyte, and the monocyte.
And so if I had to say, and so just to clarify too, we're not going to speak about the shape of the nucleus anymore. That's out the window.
Yep.
What we want to focus on now is the pattern itself, right? So how does it look inside the nucleus?
Yep.
And I think of it in terms of how clumped condensed and how kind of lacy, as you described it, the woman's garter, right? And so the most clumped would be our neutrophil, right?
Yep.
And so why is that? Why is the neutrophil the most clumped nucleus of the white cells?
Well, you got to think about what's the point of the nucleus.
Great, right? So I think, if my education serves me, that the point of the nucleus is to store genetic information for making proteins and things like that, right? Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Cool. It has the genetic information, and then it's going to use it. It's either going to translate it or going to make copies of it. And when you get to this point in the neutrophil maturation sequence, neutrophils are not going through mitosis, so there's zero reason to transcribe it or take it and copy it for any reason. And there's also, the nucleus is clumped off. It's not making anything new.
Right.
Whatever contents the neutrophil has inside of its granules, that's it. That's all it gets. So it's also not going to be taking anything and trying to make it so that it can get a protein from it. Right. So there's zero reason to need any of that DNA.
Right. So, and that's, we'll talk sometime probably about nucleated red cells, and that's another kind of extreme circumstance where the nucleus has served its function and now it's in just a storage capacity almost, right? Like it's just kind of there. And then now less clumps, I would move on to the lymphocyte, right? Still very clumped, but less so than the neutrophil. And so these cells are in some kind of a resting state. So they're kind of passively just circulating through the lymphatic system and the peripheral blood, just kind of waiting to be called upon, right? And so because they're not actively doing transcription, translation, copying, they're relatively clumped, but still not like the neutrophil, where the neutrophil, the nucleus is just used. It's there's no real use for it.
Yeah, because the lymph will use it.
Right, exactly. When the time comes, when it gets the chemical signals and antigen presented to it, whatever its job might be, it will activate, and we'll see the nucleus kind of, right? What will happen to the nucleus? It'll start to stretch out, and we'll see nucleoli start to form, right? And then in the peripheral blood, that is, the least clumped nucleus would be the mono, right? And if my reading and remembering, my recollection is accurate, a mono is still a very much in development, right? Very much in development white blood cell.
So it's not the end stage, it's a
Right.
transition stage. So the end stage is the macrophage when you're in the tissues.
Right.
So a little bit that it's still not the final stage yet, but also a little bit, like you said earlier, Dave, is that form follows function.
Yes.
So, or function is really the important reason for being. And the function of the mono is in both the regular immune system that does not respond to antigen and just is there in response to anything, and to respond, it's as an antigen presenting cell. So it is one of the only cells that has functions in both forms of the immune system. And so it's constantly moving and doing things and needing to have that granular contents or a protein or something. And it's involved in so many different processes that monos are actively using their DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so there's why put it in storage, right? When I'm going to have need access to it, right?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah.
All right.
Anything else we can think of to add?
No, I think that was a good overview of the 5 normal cells, and then comparison of the chromatin patterns for the major cell types that we're going to see frequently in a normal individual.
Awesome. Oh, well, thanks for sticking around and watching through the duration of the video. Appreciate your attention. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you'd like notifications whenever we post a new video. And feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email with comments or suggestions about future content. Thanks.